The wind carried dust across the wide and open land, the kind of land where every sound seemed sharper, every silence heavier. The sun was cruel that day, hanging above the desert as if it wanted to press every living thing flat against the earth. Out in that lonely stretch, where the sky met the ground in a haze of heat, a young woman knelt half-buried in the sand. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, and her hair clung to her cheeks with sweat. She had been left there as punishment, left to the mercy of the blazing sky and the dry earth. The people who put her there had turned their backs and walked away, their boots crunching against the hard ground, their voices fading until there was nothing but the endless wind. She was alive, but barely. And yet, even in her suffering, her eyes held a quiet fire. She had not always been seen as a disgrace. Once, she had been known for her kindness, for her way of caring when others looked the other way. But in these rough times, kindness could be twisted into weakness and mistakes. Even small ones could be punished with cruelty. The settlement she came from was a place where judgment fell heavy and mercy was rare. She had been accused of breaking rules she never meant to break, of stepping beyond the line of what a woman was allowed to do. They had whispered behind her back, called her prideful, called her a danger to the order they clung to. And when voices of reason tried to speak, they were drowned out by the louder ones that demanded shame and punishment. So they buried her alive up to her neck, in the dust and grit of the frontier ground. To them, it was justice. To her, it was despair. She could not move, could not escape. She could only wait, trapped between the sky and the earth, her body stiff in the dirt, her breath short and shallow. The hours stretched on. The sun burned her skin. The air scraped her throat. She wondered if this was how her story would end, if she would be left to die without anyone caring enough to offer her even a drop of water. But the frontier was not a place of certainties. It was a place where the unexpected could happen at any moment. And sometimes help came from where no one dared to look. She thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats first, faint and far, carried by the shifting wind. Her heart leaped, though she dared not hope. Strangers out here could be worse than death. Yet something in her, the same fire that refused to let her eyes close, whispered that someone was drawing near. From the edge of the ridge, a lone figure appeared. Tall, steady, and moving with purpose, he was not dressed like the men from the settlement. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back from his face, and his skin bore the sun's strength rather than its cruelty. He rode no grand horse draped in silver or iron, only a sturdy animal that obeyed his lightest touch. He was an Apache warrior, and the sight of him in this land was enough to send fear through the hearts of those who had left her behind. But to her, half buried and near death, he was a shadow of hope against the burning sky. He stopped a few paces from her, sliding from his horse with slow, careful steps. For a moment he said nothing, only looked at her with eyes sharp and unreadable. She wanted to speak, but her lips were too dry, her throat too raw. All that came was a soft rasp, barely more than breath. She thought he might turn and leave, as so many others had done. Instead, he knelt down in the dust, his hand resting lightly on the earth, as though he was listening to what it had to say. Then, without a word, he reached into the pouch at his side and drew out a small skin of water. She stared at it as if it were a miracle. His hand lifted it toward her, pausing just before her lips. And for the first time in hours, her cracked mouth opened, trembling as the cool drops touched her tongue. It was not much, just enough to give her life back from the edge of nothingness, but it was everything in that moment. Her chest shook as she swallowed, her eyes filling with tears that she had thought were long gone. He gave her water, simple and clear, and in doing so gave her something greater mercy in a world that had shown her none. Still, there was no promise in his gaze. She could not tell if he meant to save her or simply to ease her suffering. She wanted to ask why he was there, why he would care when her own people had cast her aside. But her voice was too weak. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes searching, begging for answers. He did not look away. For a moment, the world felt still, the burning land around them fading into silence. Yet the danger was far from over. The people who had left her there were not far, and if they returned to find an Apache warrior at her side, the punishment for both could be harsh. The frontier was cruel to those who broke its rules, and even more cruel to those who stood against its judgments. She did not know what choice he would make. If he would risk himself to pull her from the ground, or if he would vanish as suddenly as he had come. But as the wind rose again, swirling the dust between them, she felt something stirred deep within her. Perhaps her story was not ending in disgrace. Perhaps it was only beginning, reshaped by a stranger who had chosen, even for a moment, to see her as human when others had not. She could not yet move, could not yet fight. But she felt the weight of the earth loosen just a little under the strength of hope. And still the question hung in the dry air: would he free her from the ground, or would he ride away, leaving her to face the fate others had written for her? The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the desert floor, and the silence between them grew heavy with what was yet to come. The warrior's shadow stretched long across the earth as the sun tilted west, painting the land in fire-colored light. The young woman could barely keep her head lifted, but her eyes stayed locked on him. Every breath she took was a struggle, yet each sip of water he offered breathed a little more life back into her. He moved with patience, as though nothing in this wide desert was ever rushed. She wanted to cry out, to beg him not to leave her, but her voice broke into silence. He studied her carefully, the weight of his gaze saying more than any words might have carried. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered if he had been watching long before he appeared. Perhaps he had seen the settlers walk away after putting her in the ground. Perhaps he had listened from the ridge, silent and hidden, measuring what kind of woman she was before choosing to come near. The Apache people lived with caution on this land, and every choice they made meant survival. If he had stopped to give her water, it was not out of carelessness. It was a choice, and choices out here often carried heavy consequences. The memory of her own people still burned inside her. Faces she had known since childhood, voices she had trusted, had turned hard when judgment was cast. The settlement sat a half-day's ride to the east, a cluster of cabins and fences built on land that had once belonged to others. Life there was strict and narrow. Men worked the earth and cattle, women served in silence, and anyone who questioned the order of things was seen as a danger. She had not thought herself rebellious, but she had always spoken when something seemed wrong. Perhaps she had spoken one time too many. Her punishment had been decided in whispers behind closed doors, then carried out in the open ground for all to see. They said it was tradition, said it was meant to teach a lesson. But tradition can be twisted when anger and fear take hold. She had begged for understanding, for someone to hear her side, but the louder voices had already decided. When the dirt pressed against her body, she felt the weight of betrayal more than the weight of the earth itself. Now, with the warrior kneeling beside her, she wondered what he saw. Did he see a woman guilty of whatever crime they had named? Or did he see the truth that she was a scapegoat for a community too rigid to forgive? He gave no answer, no word of what passed through his thoughts. His silence was steady, like the land itself, and it unnerved her as much as it comforted her. The land around them told its own story. The wind shifted, carrying the faint call of a hawk above. The ground was cracked and thirsty, the kind of soil that fought to grow anything but stubborn weeds. This was Apache country, though settlers claimed it, with fences and rifles. Tension lived in every ridge and valley between those who had always known the land and those who had come to take it. To the settlers, an Apache warrior was an enemy. To her, right now, he was the only chance she had. Her mind flickered back to her father's warnings when she was younger. He had said the Apache were fierce, that they fought with shadows and knew the land better than any white man could hope to. Around the fire, the men spoke of raids, of stolen horses, of ambushes in the canyons. Yet there had been other stories too, quieter ones told by women who had met them at the trading posts. They said the Apache were proud that they lived with the earth instead of bending it until it broke. Those voices had been hushed, often dismissed, but she had never forgotten. And now, as she looked up at the man who had offered her water when her own kin had offered her nothing, she felt the truth of those hushed words. Still, her chest tightened with fear. If anyone from her settlement saw her here, alive because of an Apache hand, her punishment would only deepen. They had buried her once. What would they do if they believed she had allied herself with the people they called enemies? The thought made her throat close again, and not even the water could ease it. The warrior seemed to notice, his gaze narrowing, though he still did not speak. He turned his head toward the horizon, scanning the land as though he expected riders to come. The sun was lower now, the light stretching long shadows across the ground. If he meant to free her, he had a little time before darkness came. She felt her body tremble with both hope and dread. The ground held her fast, but her heart beat faster, knowing that her fate now rested in the hands of someone she barely knew. Her thoughts tumbled back to the days before all this, when life still seemed steady. She remembered the laughter of children outside the cabins, the sound of cattle bells at dawn, the way the mountains turned purple in the distance when the day ended. It had been simple, even harsh, but there was comfort in the routine. Now she wondered if she had been blind to the cracks beneath it all. Perhaps the people had always been ready to turn, waiting for someone to bear their anger. Perhaps it had been waiting for her. The warrior shifted, reaching down toward the ground near her shoulders. For one breath, she thought he might begin to dig, but instead he pressed his palm flat against the dirt. His touch was calm, almost reverent, as though he was listening again. She did not understand what he sought, but she knew he moved with purpose. His people had lived here long before the settlement ever thought to build fences. The land spoke to him in ways it never spoke to her. She tried to speak again, tried to ask him why, but her words broke into a hoarse whisper. His eyes flicked back to hers, steady and unreadable, then away again. He did not answer with sound, but with action. He poured another trickle of water to her lips, then corked the skin tight, as though rationing it carefully. Whatever he planned, it would not be done in haste. The sky above began to soften with evening colors, the hard light easing into gold. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes cried, their voices haunting across the open land. She felt the chill of dusk creeping in, even as her body still burned from the sun. Time was running thin, and still she did not know what choice he would make. Memories of her mother came back to her then, soft and steady like the evening breeze. Her mother had once told her that the world was wide, wider than the fences and rules that pressed close around them. She had not understood it as a child, but now, with the land stretching endless around her and an Apache warrior at her side, the words rang true. The world was wide, and anything could happen in it. But even wide worlds can close in quickly. Somewhere, faint on the wind, she thought she heard the sound of voices, carried from far off. Riders, perhaps, or men walking. The warrior's head lifted sharply, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Her heart leaped with fear, for if it was the settlers, her fate would be sealed again, and his presence would bring danger down on them both. The warrior did not move at once. He stood slowly, scanning the land, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his side. The horse behind him stamped once, sensing the shift in the air. The young woman could not turn to see what approach, could not do more than wait with her heart pounding against her ribs. The ground held her fast, but her spirit strained against it, desperate to know what would come next. The wind rose, carrying dust across the horizon, blurring the line between earth and sky. The voices grew clearer, closer. She wanted to call out, to beg the warrior not to leave her, not to vanish into the shadows. But her voice failed, and all she could do was watch him as the light dimmed and the tension thickened around them. Whether he would fight, flee, or free her, she did not know. But she knew one thing with certainty: the moment hanging between them would change everything. For both of them, and for the land itself. The sound of voices carried stronger now, drifting over the desert like ghosts. The young woman felt her chest tighten with panic. She had no way to see who they were, only the rising certainty that the people who had left her to die were coming back. The warrior's posture grew sharper, his frame straight and alert, his hand still near the blade at his side. His eyes moved quickly across the land, reading every shift of shadow and sound, as if the earth itself told him what approached. She lay helpless, trapped in the dirt, the fear inside her heavier than the ground, pressing against her body. The warrior crouched low again, his face calm but stern. He studied her, as if weighing her fate against his own. The water he had given her still lingered on her lips, a small sign of mercy. But mercy could not protect them both from what came. His people lived with constant threat, and to be found here with her would make him a target. Yet something in his gaze told her he had not come this far, only to turn away. She tried again to speak, to warn him of what her settlement might do, but her throat gave little more than a rasp. He seemed to understand without words. His hand brushed the ground at her shoulder, feeling the packed earth that bound her there. She thought he might begin to dig her free, but he stopped, listening again to the wind. The voices grew clearer, rough and sharp, carried by men who spoke with the certainty of those who believed they owned the land beneath their boots. Her heart pounded as the warrior stood, his shadow covering her face for a brief moment. His horse shifted, restless ears pricked toward the east where the sounds came. The woman closed her eyes for an instant, trying to gather strength from the faint coolness of dusk. But when she opened them, she saw the warrior take a step back toward his horse. Terror rushed through her. Would he leave now, vanish into the horizon, leaving her once again to the mercy of those who had condemned her? The thought cut deeper than the punishment itself. To be abandoned again, this time by the only soul who had shown her kindness, would crush what little hope she clung to. She forced her cracked lips to part, and though her voice was broken, a single word escaped, barely louder than a breath. "Please." The warrior froze at the sound. His head turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The plea hung heavy in the space between them, fragile yet powerful. For a moment his expression did not change, but then his hand dropped from the horse's reins. He returned to her side, crouching low once more, and pressed his palm into the dirt. The choice was made. He began to dig, slow at first, careful not to scrape her skin, loosening the earth that held her captive. His movements were efficient, practiced as though he had done this work before. Each handful of soil he pulled away lightened the weight on her chest, but the voices drew closer with every heartbeat. She wanted to help him, to claw her way out, but her limbs were too weak, her body too starved of water and rest. All she could do was breathe and trust in his strength. From the ridge, a laugh rang out loud, sharp and unmistakably near. Her blood turned cold. The men were close enough to see them now if they looked in the right direction. The warrior's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing toward the sound, but his hands did not stop digging. She saw the tension in his jaw, the strain of urgency held tightly behind his calm face. Her thoughts raced with fear of what might happen if the settlers found them together. The men would see her rescue as betrayal, proof that she had sided with their enemy. And for the warrior, the punishment would be worse. They would not forgive an Apache man freeing the woman they had marked for disgrace. She wanted to tell him to run, to save himself while he still could, but her lips would not shape the words. And even if they had, she knew he would not listen. The earth gave way more quickly now, and she could feel her body loosening from its prison. Her arms twitched with the first sparks of freedom, though they trembled with weakness. The warrior paused just long enough to hand her the water again, tilting it carefully so she could take another drink. Each drop felt like fire and relief at once, filling her with the faint strength she needed to survive. The voices grew louder. She could hear words now angry, careless words spoken by men who thought no one would dare oppose them. They spoke of her fate with laughter, betting on whether she would still be alive when they reached her. The cruelty cut deeper than the sun had all day. The warrior's hand brushed her shoulder, steadying her as he pulled more dirt away. At last, her arms slipped free. She gasped, the sensation of movement overwhelming after so many hours trapped. He gripped her wrist firmly, helping her lift herself as much as she could. She wanted to thank him, to weep with relief. But there was no time. From the ridge, the shape of riders appeared against the fading sky. Their silhouettes cut hard against the horizon, their voices carrying clearer now. She counted 3, maybe 4, though more could be behind. Her heart pounded. The warrior glanced toward them, then back at her. His face remained unreadable, but his body shifted, coiled like a man ready for whatever storm came next. For one terrifying moment, she thought he might leave her half-dug, mount his horse, and disappear into the desert's shadow. It would have been safer for him, but instead, he crouched lower, his hand brushing hers with a firm grip as if to remind her she was not alone. The sound of approaching hooves thundered across the land, echoing against the cliffs and canyons, each beat closer than the last. She knew this was the heart of the conflict, the place where her fate and his would collide with the will of those who sought to control everything. The settlers believed they held power over her life, and the Apache had long fought to keep their freedom. Now those two worlds met in the body of one woman buried in the dirt, and one man who chose to defy what others demanded. Her mind spun with questions. Why had he stopped for her? Why risk his own safety when he could have left her behind? Was it pity, or something deeper, something she could not yet name? She searched his face for an answer, but found only that same quiet strength. He was a man shaped by a lifetime of survival, and whatever reason he had, it was his alone. The riders crested the hill, their laughter spilling down the slope. The warrior's horse pawed the ground, restless, sensing the rising danger. The woman felt the last of the dirt break loose around her waist, but her legs remained trapped, heavy in the soil. The warrior dug faster now, his movements sharp, no longer careful, but desperate. The sound of hooves rattled closer, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The woman's heart thundered louder than the hooves. She could see their faces now, the familiar faces of men who had once shared meals and spoken kindly to her. Men who now carried whips and rifles, their mouths curled in cruel grins. The betrayal burned anew inside her chest, hot and bitter. The warrior did not look up again, his hands moving with fierce determination. She wanted to shout, to warn him that they were nearly upon them, but her voice broke before it could rise. The men's voices filled the air, calling to one another, their words laced with mockery as if this were sport to them. She could feel that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Whether freedom or capture, survival or ruin, the moment balanced on the edge of the horizon with the setting sun. And as the riders closed in, their laughter ringing, the woman felt the weight of the earth lighten at last. Though the greater weight of fate pressed heavier than ever, the riders came closer. Their laughter rolling down the ridge like thunder, the young woman's breath caught in her throat. Every hoofbeat shook the earth beneath her, rattling through her bones. She could feel her body straining against the last of the soil that held her down, her legs still trapped while her arms clawed weakly at the ground. The Apache warrior stayed beside her, his dark figure bent low, hands digging faster now, dirt flying in sharp strokes. His jaw was tight, his shoulders steady, every movement filled with urgency yet control. She glanced at the horizon, watching as the men from her settlement rode closer, their silhouettes growing sharper against the sinking sun. She recognized them, faces she had once known in kindness, now twisted with mockery. The same men who had stood silent when she was condemned, the same men who had buried her alive. Their voices carried words meant to humiliate, cruel jokes about whether she would still be breathing. Rage mixed with fear inside her, the betrayal burning deeper than the desert sun had ever burned her skin. The warrior paused only long enough to pour another drop of water at her lips. It steadied her, gave her one more spark of strength to hold on. She wanted to tell him to run, to leave before the riders saw him, but her voice was no more than a dry whisper lost in the wind. He looked at her as if he understood what she could not say, then pressed his palm against her arm, firm and grounding before returning to the dirt. The hooves grew louder, the men shouting to one another. One called out her name, dragging it through the air like an insult. She shut her eyes, the sound cutting deeper than the ropes that had bound her during her punishment. She forced them open again, and when she did, she saw the warrior's eyes locked on hers. They were steady, calm in the storm, and for a fleeting moment she felt as if nothing else mattered. The ground loosened around her hips. She gasped as she felt her body shift more freely. He gripped her arm and pulled, and with a rough jerk, she rose higher, though her legs were still caught. The riders were close enough now that she could see the whites of their eyes, the rifles resting in their hands, the sneers curling their mouths. Her heart thundered against her ribs, the rush of panic nearly drowning her. One of the riders raised his hand, pointing in their direction. A shout rang out, sharp and mocking. The others turned their horses, spurring them forward. The woman felt terror shoot through her veins. The warrior stood quickly, his knife glinting faintly in the dying light. He moved like a shadow, steady yet ready to strike. The horse behind him pawed the ground, restless, sensing the storm that was about to break. The riders closed the distance, their voices growing louder, taunting her, daring the Apache to stand his ground. She felt her breath choke, her body trembling as the earth around her gave way under the warrior's hands. She could almost move, almost break free, but the weight of soil clung to her legs. Her hands clawed at the ground, desperate to help him, but weakness still dragged at her muscles. The men laughed as they approached, their rifles gleaming, their horses kicking dust into the air. One called out, his voice dripping with mock pity, asking if she had found comfort in the company of a savage. Another shouted that they should let her rot where she was, that she had made her choice. Their words were knives, cutting into wounds that had never healed. She looked at them with fury in her eyes, though her body was too frail to fight. The warrior did not flinch at their words. His eyes narrowed, his body shifting slightly, as if measuring every distance their horses, their weapons, the path of escape. He moved with the patience of a man who had fought many battles and learned when to strike. His hand brushed hers once more, grounding her in the storm. Then he pressed his shoulder into the dirt and freed more soil around her legs. She gasped as her knees came loose, the first full movement she had felt in endless hours. The riders slowed their pace, circling now like wolves around prey. Their laughter had shifted into something harder, sharper. They were not here just to mock, they wanted to prove their power, to show the cost of defiance. She could feel the danger thick in the air, heavier than the weight of earth that still clung to her. The warrior rose, standing tall between her and the riders. He held no rifle, only the knife at his side, but the way he carried himself made him look as strong as the mountains behind them. The riders shouted again, their voices full of threats, telling him to step away, to leave her to the fate they had chosen for her. He did not move. His silence was louder than their shouts, his stillness more dangerous than their weapons. She felt her legs finally pull free, though weak and shaking. The warrior crouched once more, his hand gripping her arm, helping her rise slowly from the earth. Her body screamed in protest, her knees buckling, but his grip steadied her. She stood for the first time, swaying in the fading light, dirt falling from her clothes like broken chains. Her breath tore in and out, her heart racing as she looked at the men who had tried to bury her life. The riders saw her standing now, and their laughter died. The mockery in their eyes shifted into something darker, something sharper. They raised their rifles higher, the metal glinting against the dying sun. She froze, fear locking her in place. The warrior shifted, his body placing itself fully between her and the men. The horses circled closer, hooves kicking dust into the air, voices rising in threats. She could not hear every word, but she knew the meaning. To them, she was no longer simply a woman to be shamed. She was now a traitor, a symbol of defiance. And the Apache at her side was the enemy who had given her back what they had taken away. Together, they were a challenge to the order the settlement clung to, and challenges were not forgiven. Her throat burned as she tried to speak, to call out to the men she had once trusted, to remind them of the humanity they had buried along with her. But no sound came, only a hoarse cry lost in the dust. They did not listen. Their eyes were hard, their fingers tight on their rifles. The warrior stood unmoving, his hands still gripping hers, his body braced against the storm. The woman felt the fear coil inside her, but alongside it came something else, a spark of strength she thought had been buried forever. The earth no longer held her, and though her legs trembled, she stood. The danger was close, closer than ever, yet she felt alive in a way she had not in years. The riders circled, their shadows long across the desert, their voices harsh in the dimming light. The air was charged, as if the land itself held its breath. The young woman's heart thundered, her pulse rushing in her ears. She knew the moment of reckoning was near, the point where silence would break into action. The warrior shifted his stance, knife glinting once more. The riders drew tighter circles, rifles raised, words sharp with hatred. The woman stood between them all, caught in the center of a storm she had never chosen but could no longer escape. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long. And the desert held its silence, waiting for the moment when everything would break. The riders circled closer, their rifles lifted, their voices laced with anger. Dust rose around them in a thick cloud, hanging in the fading light. The young woman stood unsteady on her feet, leaning against the Apache warrior, who had dug her out of the earth. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but she held her head high, refusing to bow to the men who had buried her. She could feel the pounding of her heart in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum, telling her she was alive despite everything they had done. The warrior's silence was his strength. He did not shout, did not threaten. He simply stood firm between her and the danger, his knife gleaming faintly in his hand. The riders barked out orders, telling him to step aside, to leave her for them to finish. They cursed him, calling him an enemy, calling her a disgrace. Yet neither of them moved. The air was tight with tension, ready to break with one wrong step. Then one of the men spurred his horse forward, circling closer than the others. He laughed, the sound cruel and sharp, and raised his rifle high. The woman flinched, but before he could take aim, the warrior stepped forward with sudden force. His movement was swift, his presence so strong it made the horse rear back, kicking the air. The rider cursed, struggling to steady the animal, while the others shouted in anger. For a moment, it seemed the fight would explode, but then the warrior lowered his blade, his eyes locked on the men with an unspoken warning. He would not strike first, but neither would he retreat. The standoff stretched, the desert holding its breath. At last, the leader of the riders spat into the dirt and called her name again. He spoke loudly, declaring that if she left with the Apache, she would never be welcome in the settlement again. She would be an outcast, cut off from the only home she had known. The words cut deep, but as she stood there, dirt falling from her torn clothes, she realized the truth. That home had abandoned her long before she ever met the warrior. They had buried her alive without hesitation. Whatever she had lost, it had been lost the moment they chose cruelty over mercy. Her voice finally broke free, raw and unsteady, but strong enough to carry. She told them they had already made their choice, that she would not beg to return to a place that had treated her as less than human. The words surprised even her. For the first time, she felt the weight of fear slip away, replaced with something fiercer. The men sneered at her, but she saw doubt flicker in their eyes. She was not broken. She had stood again. The warrior placed his hand gently against her arm, guiding her back toward his horse. The riders cursed and shouted, threatening what they would do if she left with him. But their voices sounded weaker now, their certainty cracking. They had expected her to crumble, to crawl back to them in shame. Instead, she turned away. The warrior lifted her onto his horse, steadying her weak frame with surprising care. Then he climbed up behind her, his hand gripping the reins with calm strength. The horse shifted, restless under the weight, but obeyed his command. He turned the animal west, away from the ridge, away from the settlement. The riders shouted after them, but none dared to move closer. They knew his skill, knew the risk of striking against him in the open desert. The sound of their anger faded with distance as the horse carried them into the growing night. The woman leaned against the warrior's chest, her body trembling from both fear and relief. The rhythm of the horse's hooves steadied her, carrying her farther from the place of her disgrace. The desert stretched wide ahead, endless and open, the sky darkening into stars. For the first time since the punishment began, she felt the air fill her lungs fully. She was free. The journey that followed was long and silent. The warrior gave her water sparingly, careful not to waste a drop. He did not speak, but his presence was constant, a steady comfort in the uncertain night. She thought of asking him why he had saved her, but the words never left her lips. Perhaps she already knew. He had seen her humanity where others had not. That was reason enough. When dawn came, the horizon painted itself in gold. They stopped near a shallow stream hidden between rocks. The warrior helped her down gently, letting her rest on the cool ground. She cupped the water in her hands, drinking until her throat no longer burned. She washed the dirt from her face, watching the water carry it away. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again, though changed in ways she could not yet name. The warrior stood a short distance away, watching the land. His silence still weighed heavy, but it no longer felt distant. It felt like a bond, unspoken yet understood. She realized then that she did not need words to know the truth. He had chosen to see her not as a disgrace, but as a person worth saving. That choice had reshaped her world. In the days that followed, she grew stronger. Her legs, weak from being trapped, began to carry her once more. She walked beside the warrior as they traveled deeper into the wild land, away from the fences and rules of the settlement. Each step took her farther from the life she had known, yet closer to something she had never imagined. Freedom tasted strange, but it was sweeter than the bitter shame she had left behind. She thought often of the settlement, of the faces that had condemned her. At times, anger filled her chest, sharp and burning. At other times, sadness weighed heavy, knowing that the people she had cared for could turn so easily against her. But more than either of these, she felt a sense of clarity. She understood now that survival was not just about breath and body, it was about dignity, about being seen as human, even in the harshest of places. That was what the warrior had given her when he offered her water. The land itself seemed to echo that lesson. Each sunrise was a reminder that life could begin again, even after the darkest night. Each step across the desert reminded her that the earth, though unforgiving, also gave strength to those who endured it. She carried these truths with her, as heavy and precious as the water they rationed together. In time, they reached the warrior's people. She feared at first how they might see her, an outsider from the settlement, marked by disgrace. But when they looked at her, she did not see the same judgment she had known before. She saw cautious eyes, yes, but also curiosity, and in some faces, understanding. They welcomed her not with open arms at once, but with patience, watching how she walked, how she listened, how she carried herself after all she had survived. Slowly, she earned her place among them. The warrior never explained his reasons for saving her, but she came to see them in his actions. In the way he guided her steps when she faltered. In the way he shared his water though it risked his own. In the way he stood silent yet firm against those who threatened her. His reasons were not carved in words, but in choices, and those choices became the foundation of her new life. Looking back, she knew she could never return to the settlement. Even if they begged her now, even if they offered forgiveness, she would not walk that path again. The earth they had buried her in had been meant to silence her. Instead, it had birthed her into something new. She was no longer the woman they had condemned. She was a woman who had looked death in the face and risen again, carried forward by mercy and strength. The story of her punishment, her disgrace, and her rescue would remain with her forever, not as a wound, but as a reminder. A reminder that cruelty can strip away everything, but cannot kill the spirit that chooses to stand again. A reminder that compassion, even in the smallest drop of water, can change the course of a life. A reminder that freedom is not given, it is taken by those who refuse to be broken. As the seasons turned and the land shifted around her, she carried these truths like a flame in her chest. And though the memory of her suffering never fully left her, it became a source of strength. She had been buried, but she had not been defeated. She had been cast aside, but she had been found again. The desert wind carried her story across the land, whispering it through the canyons and across the plains. And when she lifted her face to the wide sky, she knew she had found something greater than the life she had lost. She had found her own place, her own strength, and her own freedom. And in that truth, she was no longer a woman of disgrace. She was a woman reborn, alive in the heart of a land that could never again silence her.